If you're thinking of buying a smartphone this year and you don't mind spending top dollar on it, Samsung has a lot of options for you. There's the Galaxy S20 series from earlier this year. There's the reasonably priced for foldables, at least, Z Flip and Z Flip 5G. And if you really wanted to go out there, there's the Galaxy Fold and the Galaxy Z Fold 2. And that crowd just got bigger with the addition of the Galaxy Note 20 and Note 20 Ultra. Now, these phones come at an interesting time because devices like the Galaxy S20 Ultra have kind of encroached on the territory that the Notes were known for. With these new Notes, Samsung is trying to define a new niche for these devices where they don't have to worry about interference from the rest of Samsung's phones. And after learning more about the Note 20 and the Note 20 Ultra, I have some concerns. When I think of the Galaxy Note, I think of big screens and powerful processors and the S Pen. So let's start with the biggest, most powerful version of the Note 20 Ultra. Now, suffice to say, this is a big phone. It has a 6.9-inch dynamic AMOLED 2X display, so it runs at the relative equivalent of Quad HD. That screen also refreshes at 120 Hz, bringing it in line with what we saw out of this year's Galaxy S20s. Now that's an important point, and we'll circle back to that in a little bit. I think it's safe to say that because there is no properly small version of the Note 20 this year, people with big hands are really the only people who should consider these devices. Speaking of big things, the camera hump on the Galaxy Note 20 Ultra is enormous. It doesn't seem dramatically different than the one we got on the S20 Ultra, but the new sort of bronze finish that Samsung is really going big on this year kind of draws a lot of attention to it. It's hard to miss. The similarities between this phone and the S20 Ultra don't end with just the hump itself. What's inside that hump, the cameras themselves, are pretty familiar too. The Note 20 Ultra uses the same 108 megapixel ISO sensor for the wide-angle camera on the Note 20 Ultra, which means you're getting pretty consistently good shots out of this thing. This is not my favorite sensor in the world, but Samsung is getting a lot of mileage out of it, and for the most part, it's pretty inoffensive. The 12 megapixel ultra-wide in the Note 20 Ultra also appears to be the same ultra-wide that we saw in the Galaxy S20 Ultra. Really, the big difference is in the telephoto camera. The S20 Ultra used a 48 megapixel sensor. The Note 20 Ultra uses a slightly more conventional, let's say, 12 megapixel telephoto sensor for this camera. Basically, it has a slightly narrower field of view, but it does give you a slightly wider aperture. So you should get slightly better performance in lower light. Oh, and that depth vision sensor we got on the S20 Ultra is gone completely. Here, Samsung used a laser autofocus module, which should help lock onto your subjects really, really quickly. The biggest change might actually be Samsung's approach to space zoom. Here on the Note 20 Ultra, that maximum zoom is capped to 50x, which frankly, we're totally fine with. The 100x zoom, in addition to just being conceptually kind of creepy, produced photos that almost always looked terrible. It was largely pointless, and I'm glad we don't have to deal with that here. Based on this phone's name and its very similar cameras, it would be easy to assume that Samsung basically just noted up an S20 Ultra and called it a day. And that's not untrue, but there are some differences here. The Note 20 Ultra uses, for example, the Snapdragon 865 Plus chipset with 12 gigs of RAM. That's a version of the 865 that's rated for slightly higher clock speed, so you should be able to get slightly better performance out of this thing. I do say slightly. We haven't really tested this thing very thoroughly yet, but I can't imagine that most people will see a significant difference in horsepower in their day-to-day lives. Now, it's worth noting here that every version of the Galaxy Note 20 Ultra you can buy comes with 12 gigs of RAM, but you have some pretty significant differences in the storage options. The base level $1,300 Galaxy Note 20 Ultra has 128 gigs of storage, which you can further augment thanks to a microSD card slot. If you really needed all the space you can get, Samsung will also offer a version of this phone with 512 gigs of internal storage, which again has that microSD card slot. Interesting note, the regular Galaxy Note 20 doesn't have a microSD card slot, even though that device arguably needs it more, but we'll get to that in a little bit. There are just a few other things I want to note about the Galaxy Note 20 Ultra. The latency of its S Pen has been reduced pretty dramatically. It's down to about 9 milliseconds, so it means there's virtually zero lag from the moment you start writing on the screen and the moment you start seeing those letters appear. Kind of makes the experience a little more natural, which is always nice when you're putting a stylus to glass. Samsung also moved the S Pen's enclosure to the other side of the phone. Now it's on the bottom left corner instead of the bottom right, which really doesn't seem like that big a deal, but I can already feel myself getting prematurely frustrated at reaching for the S Pen and it not being where I expect it to be, and I'm not feeling great about it. Now, of course, the Galaxy Note was never just about the hardware. The software really helps define what this phone is, and Samsung has done a lot of work on this front. For one, we've got new air actions, and if you're not familiar, those are the sort of magic wand gestures you're able to do with the S Pen to control the phone in certain small ways. This year, Samsung has kind of expanded on those gestures to allow for actual control over the interface of the phone. So if you want to go back to the home screen or see your recent apps or go back one level, you can perform those sort of jagged, angular magic wand gestures with the S Pen to do so. Now, I keep mentioning some of these gestures are more jagged because Samsung went with different ones in certain cases last year. I remember the camera on the Note 10, you could zoom by sort of spinning circles in the air with the S Pen, and that didn't really give you a lot of control. The kind of angular gestures that Samsung is going with this year feel like they could be more precise than what we got, which I'm definitely never going to complain about. Still, these new air actions raise a pretty interesting question. How many times do you find yourself needing to jump between different apps or go back or generally just navigate your phone when you're not holding it? I can think of very little scenarios in which I would need that, and maybe I'm in the minority, but I think it's safe to say that this new S Pen feature isn't going to work for everybody. Thankfully, some of the S Pen-centric features are just a little more practical. You can mark up PDFs in the Note app, for example, or if you like to record audio in the middle of meetings or lectures or whatever, you can tap things you were writing at that time to jump to specific points in that audio recording, which is genuinely very cool. This might be my favorite thing about the Note experience so far, but I don't know that that's going to make a believer out of someone who wasn't a Note fan in the first place. Samsung will also live sync your notes directly to the cloud, and while we're on the subject of the cloud, Microsoft is teaming up with Samsung to bring Xbox Game Pass Ultimate streaming via the cloud to the Galaxy Note 20 series as of, I believe, September 15th. It's a nice touch in Samsung's clear attempt to make this device just as well suited to play as it is for work, but we'll have to see how that actually works. The Note 20 Ultra is also one of the few devices that we're aware of that have UWB, or ultra-wideband radio support. Really, the first time we heard about a manufacturer doing this with a phone was with Apple and its most recent iPhones. Basically, they allowed you to do really neat things like directional airdrop by transferring files to a device that you've pointed your own device at, and to some extent unlocking your car and controlling it with an iPhone. Samsung says it's working on a similar directional file sharing feature that can only be used between UWB phones, which for now is just the S20 Ultra, and at some point you will also be able to unlock your car with that radio, so we'll see how that goes. And that's really what I would ask you to keep in mind. All of those features that I just mentioned, no matter how simple or valuable they might seem as I describe them to you, Samsung has yet to show off a version of the Note 20 Ultra with final feature-complete software, so it's really anyone's guess how well any of this stuff works at the moment. All in all, the Note 20 Ultra kind of feels like what we expected. It's a big, powerful phone that doesn't make a lot of compromises and generally seems to work pretty well for productivity and for play. Even with its many tweaks and clever refinements, the Note 20 Ultra doesn't feel that much different than the Galaxy S20 Ultra and devices of that ilk. Now, as I've mentioned, there is a conversation going on right now as to whether the Note line really needs to exist when devices like the Galaxies are doing most of what people wanted out of the Galaxy Note. I don't think that the Note 20 Ultra makes a great case. It's a perfectly nice phone, and I'm really looking forward to testing it, but it's not going to make you a Galaxy Note believer if you weren't one already. Honestly, it kind of just feels like Samsung now has to continue making a phone with a pen because it insisted on it for so long, and that's what we're getting this year.